A 7-year-old girl was screaming as they dragged her up the 80-foot tower, but her cries were nothing compared to the sound she made when she hit the rocks below. This wasn't an accident or a crime of passion. This was justice, Roman style, carried out in front of cheering crowds who brought their children to watch. But this little girl's death was just the beginning of an execution method so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that it would haunt human civilization for over 2,000 years. The worst cases involved those who remained conscious but paralyzed, able to feel everything as carrion birds began their feast before life had completely left their broken bodies. Roman observers documented these variations with the detached interest of scientists, noting which body positions produced the most entertaining deaths. The ritual surrounding these executions revealed the depths of Roman cruelty. The integration of execution capabilities into religious and secular architecture reveals how normalized this practice became in medieval society. The Spanish Inquisition elevated defenestration to new heights of systematic cruelty. Accused heretics faced a choice that was no choice at all: confess to crimes they hadn't committed and face burning at the stake, or maintain their innocence and be thrown from the Giralda Tower in Seville. The inquisitors had calculated that the fear of falling was so intense that many victims would confess to anything rather than face the terror of defenestration. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about historical punishment, because throwing people alive from great heights was not just about killing them, it was about destroying their very humanity in the most public, humiliating way possible. And the twisted minds who perfected this method found ways to make death by falling so much worse than you could ever imagine. The year was 263 BCE, and Rome had just discovered the perfect execution method: the Tarpeian rock. A jagged cliff on the Capitoline Hill became the stage where traitors, murderers, the Catholic Church declared that heretics thrown from cathedral towers were being cast out by God Himself, their falling bodies, proof of divine judgment. The architecture of European cities was deliberately designed to facilitate these aerial executions. Bell towers, castle walls, and church spires all served double duty as monuments to faith and platforms for murder. The height variations allowed authorities to calibrate their cruelty. Minor heretics might be thrown from 40 feet. Some victims were bound in specific positions to ensure they would land in ways that prolonged their agony, while others were weighted with chains to increase the force of impact. The psychological dimension of defenestration proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Unlike other execution methods, where victims could maintain some dignity in their final moments, being thrown from a height stripped away every vestige of human control, and enemies of the state would experience the ultimate punishment: being hurled alive into empty air gravity, becoming their executioner, the earth itself rejecting their broken bodies. But the Romans didn't just push people off cliffs. They turned it into an art form, a spectacle of terror that would make modern horror movies seem tame by comparison. They calculated the exact height needed to ensure maximum suffering, high enough to guarantee death, but not so high that unconsciousness would mercifully claim victims before impact. The falling victim became a helpless object subject to the laws of physics, their final seconds consumed by primal terror as the ground rushed up to meet them. Witnesses described the sounds, not just the impact, but the screams that began the moment victims left the platform and continued until their voices were silenced by death. These screams, amplified by the acoustic properties of the execution sites, could be heard for miles, carrying the message of state power to entire populations. Medieval chroniclers documented the theatrical elements that authorities added to enhance the spectacle. Many collapsed from terror before reaching the top, only to be dragged the remaining distance by guards who had perfected the art of keeping victims conscious until the final moment. But Rome was just the beginning. As the empire spread, so did the practice of defenestration, the technical term that sanitizes the reality of throwing living human beings from windows, towers, and cliffs. Medieval Europe embraced this method with religious fervor, literally suffering broken bones, but potentially surviving as crippled warnings to others, while major enemies of the faith earned the full 100-foot treatment that guaranteed obliteration. The most famous case of medieval defenestration occurred in Prague in 1419, launching the Hussite Wars and demonstrating how throwing people from windows could literally reshape European history. Protestant nobles seized Prague Castle and systematically hurled Catholic officials from the tower windows. The architecture of execution evolved as authorities recognized the potential of defenestration. Castle architects began incorporating purpose-built execution platforms that extended from tower walls, creating maximum drama and ensuring optimal viewing angles for crowds. Some of these platforms featured trapdoors that could be activated remotely, adding an element of mechanical precision to what had been a purely physical act. Churches installed special windows high in their towers, positioned to catch the morning light and provide clear sight lines for maximum audience impact. Mongol law decreed that royal blood should not be shed directly, so captured princes and kings were wrapped in carpets and thrown from cliffs. This practice technically preserved the taboo against spilling noble blood while still achieving the desired fatal result. The carpets served multiple purposes. They prevented the victims from grabbing onto anything during their fall. They concealed the victim's identity from spectators until impact. And they created a bundle that would tumble unpredictably, adding to the horror of the spectacle. The victims who survived their fall into the courtyard were beaten to death by waiting crowds, but those who died on impact were considered fortunate. The psychological impact of this mass defenestration rippled across Europe, proving that even the most powerful religious authorities could be literally cast down by their enemies. The symbolism was unmistakable. Those who claimed divine authority could be thrown from their lofty positions just like anyone else. 80 feet was the magic number, providing just enough time for complete terror, while ensuring the crowd below could see every expression of agony cross the victim's face. What made this method truly diabolical was its unpredictability. Unlike beheading or hanging, where death was swift and certain, falling from the Tarpeian rock offered a grotesque lottery of suffering. Some victims died instantly when their skulls split open on the jagged rocks. Others survived the impact with shattered bones and ruptured organs, lying in pools of their own blood while the crowd watched them slowly die. Islamic societies developed their own variations of aerial execution, often using minarets as launching points for those who had violated religious law. The Ottoman Empire perfected a particularly cruel variant where victims were thrown from the Tower of Justice in the Topkapi Palace. But the Ottomans added a twist that reveals the depths of human creativity in designing suffering. They would throw victims at dawn when the morning light would illuminate their faces for the watching crowd, or at sunset when the dying light would create dramatic silhouettes against the sky. Victims weren't simply marched to their death. They were paraded through the streets in chains, forced to wear signs describing their crimes, while citizens threw garbage, stones, and human waste at them. Children were given time off from school to witness these educational spectacles, and teachers would point out the moral lessons as bodies plummeted to their destruction. The condemned were required to climb the tower themselves, adding psychological torture to physical destruction. Some execution sites featured musicians who would play funeral dirges as victims were prepared for throwing. Others employed announcers who would narrate the proceedings for distant crowds, describing the victim's crime and calling for divine judgment. The most elaborate executions included costume elements. Traitors might be dressed in black, heretics in white, and murderers in red, creating a color-coded system of condemnation that was visible even from great distances. These theatrical touches transformed individual executions into community-wide performances of justice and terror. Families of the executed were sometimes forced to watch from distant vantage points, unable to recover their loved ones' remains or provide proper funeral rites. Those who chose the tower discovered that even this choice was illusory. They were often tortured before being thrown, ensuring they arrived at the precipice already broken in body and spirit. The Inquisition's records, preserved in church archives, document these procedures with bureaucratic precision that makes the cruelty even more chilling. But perhaps the most sophisticated practitioners of aerial execution were the Mongol Empire, who developed variations that reflected their complex cultural beliefs about honor, blood, and death. The Mongols also pioneered the use of natural execution sites, utilizing the dramatic landscapes they encountered during their conquests. Mountain precipices, coastal cliffs, and river gorges all served as stages for defenestration, often in locations so remote that bodies were never recovered. This denial of burial added another layer of punishment, as many cultures believed that proper interment was necessary for the soul's journey to the afterlife. Chinese historical records from territories conquered by the Mongols describe the psychological warfare aspects of these executions. The sight of wrapped figures being thrown from mountain peaks became a symbol of Mongol dominance that could be seen for miles. Local populations learned to associate certain geographic features with death, creating psychological no-go zones that persisted long after the Mongols had moved on. The landscape itself became a tool of oppression, with natural beauty transformed into reminders of brutal authority. Renaissance. Italy saw the practice of defenestration evolve into a tool of political assassination disguised as execution. The Medici family and other powerful houses would eliminate rivals by having them thrown from palazzo windows, often during supposedly social gatherings. The case of Galeazzo Sforza in Milan exemplifies this trend. Invited to a banquet at the Castello Sforzesco, he was seized during the meal and thrown from a tower window. Witnesses reported that he survived the initial fall and attempted to crawl away before being finished off by waiting soldiers, creating a spectacle that combined the formal elements of execution with the intimate violence of murder. The colonial period saw European powers export their execution methods to the New World, where defenestration took on additional layers of racial and cultural domination. Spanish conquistadors, through indigenous leaders from temple pyramids, deliberately choosing these sacred sites to maximize the symbolic impact on native populations. These executions served multiple purposes: eliminating resistance leaders, demonstrating Spanish power, and desecrating indigenous religious sites simultaneously. The height of Mesoamerican pyramids provided ideal platforms for defenestration, with steps that could accommodate large crowds of forced witnesses. Colonial records from Mexico and Peru describe how indigenous peoples were compelled to watch their leaders thrown from their own sacred structures. The psychological impact of seeing their spiritual and political authorities literally cast down from their holiest sites created trauma that rippled through entire civilizations. Some indigenous communities abandoned their temple complexes after witnessing such executions, unable to overcome the association between their sacred spaces and the death of their leaders. The practice persisted into the modern era with technological updates that maintained the core elements of terror and spectacle. During Argentina's military dictatorship of the 1970s and 1980s, political prisoners were thrown from aircraft over the ocean in what became known as death flights. Though technologically updated, these modern aerial executions retained the essential characteristics of defenestration: the helplessness of victims, the use of height and gravity as weapons, and the psychological impact on those who knew such fates awaited enemies of the state. The Lebanese Civil War saw a return to more traditional defenestration as various factions threw prisoners from Beirut's high-rise buildings. These urban executions created a new dynamic where apartment buildings and office complexes became impromptu execution sites, transforming the everyday architecture of modern cities into potential stages for medieval brutality. The randomness of these locations added to the terror. Any building might become an execution site. Any window might become a launching point for death. Throughout all these historical periods and cultural variations, certain constants emerge that reveal the psychological foundations of defenestration as an execution method. The use of height creates a vertical hierarchy that mirrors social power structures. Those with authority literally stand above those they condemn. The act of throwing transforms the victim from a person into an object, stripping away human agency and dignity. The public nature of the execution creates collective complicity, forcing entire communities to witness and thereby participate in state-sanctioned murder. The survival accounts that do exist provide harrowing insights into the experience of defenestration. Those who lived through falls from moderate heights describe the initial moment of weightlessness giving way to accelerating terror as the ground rushes up. Time perception distorts, with some survivors reporting that the fall seemed to last forever, while others remember only fragments. The body's automatic responses, flailing limbs, attempts to right oneself, the instinct to grab at anything, would have been visible to observers Adding to the horror of the spectacle, medical understanding of fall injuries reveals the gruesome variety of ways defenestration could kill or maim. High falls often resulted in multiple trauma, shattered skulls, broken spines, ruptured organs, and massive internal bleeding. Victims who survived the initial impact might linger for hours or days, providing extended entertainment for crowds and prolonged agony for the condemned. The unpredictability of these outcomes was part of the method's appeal to authorities. Each execution was a unique performance with an uncertain ending. The gradual abandonment of defenestration as a formal execution method reflects broader changes in social attitudes toward punishment and human dignity. Enlightenment thinking questioned the spectacular nature of public executions, arguing that such displays brutalized both executioners and spectators. The development of modern nation states with bureaucratic legal systems favored standardized, predictable execution methods over the variability of defenestration. Urbanization and changing architectural patterns made traditional execution sites less available or practical. Yet even as formal judicial defenestration disappeared, the practice persisted in other forms. Extrajudicial killings, political assassinations, and warfare continued to feature death by throwing from heights. The symbolic power of the falling body maintained its grip on human imagination even as official legal systems abandoned the practice. Modern instances remind us that the capacity for such cruelty remains latent in human societies, waiting to resurface whenever authority seeks to demonstrate its power through spectacular violence. The legacy of defenestration extends beyond its historical practice to influence our language, literature, and collective consciousness. The term itself has entered common usage to describe the forcible removal of people from positions of power. Literary works, from Dante's Inferno to modern crime novels, employ falling as a metaphor for moral collapse and divine judgment. The image of the falling body continues to appear in art, film, and popular culture as a symbol of ultimate powerlessness and terror. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that defenestration reveals something fundamental about human nature: the capacity to transform basic physical forces into instruments of elaborate cruelty. The practice required no advanced technology, no specialized training, no expensive equipment. It used gravity itself as a weapon, turning the simple act of falling into an execution method that combined physical destruction with psychological terror. This accessibility meant that defenestration could be employed by anyone with sufficient authority and a suitable height, making it a democratic form of tyranny available to rulers throughout history. The study of defenestration also reveals the importance of spectacle in maintaining political and social control. These executions were never private affairs. They required audiences to achieve their full effect. The gathered crowds became both witnesses and participants, their presence legitimizing the state's right to kill in such spectacular fashion. The theatrical elements, the processions, the costumes, the architectural staging, transformed individual deaths into community-wide performances of power that would be remembered and discussed for generations. Understanding this history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human civilization. The same species that created great art, literature, and philosophy also developed systematic methods for transforming death into entertainment. The architectural marvels we admire today, medieval castles, Renaissance palaces, ancient temples, often served double duty as execution sites where human beings were hurled to their deaths for the education and amusement of crowds. The normalization of such practices in so many different cultures and time periods suggests that the capacity for systematic cruelty is not an aberration, but a persistent feature of human societies. The victims of defenestration, from anonymous slaves thrown from Roman cliffs to political prisoners hurled from modern aircraft, represent the countless individuals whose suffering was transformed into spectacle by those in power. Their deaths served as warnings, entertainment, and proof of authority, but behind each execution was a human being whose final moments were consumed by terror and pain. Remembering their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization becomes an act of historical justice, acknowledging the cost of power structures built on spectacular violence. Today, as we witness new forms of spectacular violence broadcast through digital media, the history of defenestration offers sobering lessons about humanity, its capacity for cruelty, and the enduring appeal of turning suffering into spectacle. The methods may evolve, but the underlying dynamics, the use of terror to maintain control, the transformation of individual death into public performance, the complicity of audiences in state sanctioned violence remain disturbingly constant across cultures and centuries.